This is my story. I spent my entire life working with my hands, sewing, stitching, saving, all for my son. I gave him everything I never had: warm meals, clean clothes, good schools, and a roof that didn't leak when it rained. I thought that when I grew old, he would honor me. But one evening during dinner at our villa, I simply asked for another slice of bread. And he didn't just refuse. He threw a glass of red wine into my face. Everyone at the table saw it. No one stopped him. I didn't fight back. I quietly stood up, walked to my small room upstairs, and began to plan. You won't believe what I did next. But before I continue, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. I wasn't born into comfort. My childhood was a struggle stitched together with calloused hands and endless nights. I started working at 12, sewing hems for other women's dresses, mending coats I could never afford. Later, I cleaned shops, pressed shirts, and took every small job that kept the lights on at Grace Taylor & Company, my little sewing shop in Savannah. I never thought about myself. Every dollar I earned, every penny I saved, I thought of my family. When my husband passed and I had my only son, Daniel, I made a promise. He would never know the kind of hunger I had known. I wanted him to study, to grow up safe, to walk through life on the path I had paved with my own worn-out shoes. I didn't care if my back bent or my eyes blurred from the needle and thread, as long as he had comfort. That was my duty as a mother, and I carried it out without complaint. When he was little, I bought him his first school uniform with the week's savings. I remember skipping my own meals just to afford it. I'd come home with my hands trembling from exhaustion, but seeing his smile when I handed him new notebooks made it all worth it. Even when tuition rose and the bills stacked high, I told myself education was his key to a future better than mine. So I tightened every belt, denied myself small joys, and made sure he never went without. When he wanted his first bicycle, I sold my old sewing machine and bought it. Later, when he wanted his first car, I handed him my entire savings. That car cost more than anything I had ever owned. But I wasn't sad. He was my pride. I wanted him to stand tall among his friends, not feel ashamed of his humble mother. When Daniel got married, I paid for most of the ceremony myself. I lived modestly, but I wanted his wedding to be grand, a day when everyone would look at him with admiration. I even helped with the down payment for their first house, the villa in Sarasota. I told him, "This is the foundation for your new family. Build it strong." What I didn't say was that the money came from my own retirement savings. But I didn't mind. I believed that love and gratitude would return to me in time, that blood would always stay loyal, that respect between mother and son was natural. So I opened a joint bank account with him, thinking that sharing control would teach him responsibility. I believed seeing my name beside his would make him proud, a reminder that every dollar came from my labor. But I was wrong. It only fed his arrogance. You said, I thought that seeing my name beside his on the bank papers would make him proud, that it would remind him every dollar came from me, every sacrifice stitched into his success. But no, it only made him arrogant. Instead of gratitude, he began to act as if everything I owned was already his by birthright. He spent recklessly, buying gadgets, hosting parties, taking trips with friends, throwing money like confetti. Whenever I asked about saving, he brushed me off. "Mom, don't worry, I've got it." He never realized that legally, those accounts still belonged to me. He mistook my generosity for surrender. I had worked all my life. I had given all my life. And I truly believed that when I grew frail, my son would treat me with tenderness. I dreamed he'd one day say, "Mother, you've worked hard enough. Let me take care of you now." That was my hope, my purpose through every storm. I bent over my sewing table until my spine ached. I pricked my fingers until they bled. I stitched dresses under flickering light while thunder rolled outside. Every hem, every seam, every dollar was for his future. My entire being was defined by the act of giving, and I was proud of that. When neighbors said I spoiled him, I ignored them. When my late husband once said I gave too much, I told him not to worry, because one day Daniel would repay our love with kindness. But I was wrong. What I mistook for love was dependency. What I thought was pride turned into arrogance, and what I believed was family became humiliation. Looking back now, I see clearly. Every sacrifice only taught him how to take more. Every gift became an expectation. My role as a mother had been reshaped into that of a servant, and I was too blind to see it until it was too late. But back then, before the night he threw that glass of wine in my face, I still believed he could change. I thought patience would teach him respect. I thought silence would remind him of love. I was wrong. The early signs of disrespect were subtle, almost invisible, but they grew louder with time. It started with the way he spoke to me. Short answers, no eye contact, as if my words were a waste of his time. I'd sit in the living room trying to share stories of the hard days when I built Grace Taylor & Co. with nothing but a borrowed sewing machine. But he'd roll his eyes and say, "Yeah, Mom, I know. You worked hard. You've told me that 100 times." He didn't hear wisdom. He heard boredom. I thought, maybe he's just tired. Maybe business is stressful. So I forgave him. But slowly, it became clear. He no longer saw me as his mother. He saw me as a burden. When I asked for small favors, a trip to the pharmacy, a box of medicine, he sighed as if I had ruined his day. If I asked for a ride to my doctor, he grumbled about gas money, as though the woman who once bought his first car was now freeloading off him. Even household expenses, which I still contributed to, became excuses for complaints. He'd sneer, "Do you really eat that much, Mom?" Or, "Feeding you costs more than feeding my kids." Those words cut deep, because I remembered the nights I went hungry so he could eat. And now, the same child I once fed by hand was counting every bite that reached my lips. The same son I once fed spoonful by spoonful was now counting the bites on my plate. My medical bills had become his favorite weapon. One time, when I was short on cash and asked him to cover a prescription, he muttered, "You should feel lucky I even let you live here." I wanted to remind him that the house he bragged about was built with my labor. Every wall, every brick, every nail was paid for with the money I earned from endless nights behind a sewing machine. But I stayed silent, believing that arguing with my own son would only push him further away. He loved showing off to neighbors, telling them how he was taking care of his poor mother. He'd laugh and call me his charity case, boasting that I lived under his roof. I never corrected him, even though the truth was the opposite. I didn't want to expose him in front of others. I still believed some dignity could be salvaged in silence, but inside, everything was collapsing. Marissa, my daughter-in-law, was no different. She spoke to me as though I were an unwelcome guest who had stayed too long. If I sat in the living room for a while, she would turn off the TV and say she needed quiet. If I left my slippers by the door, she'd frown and call me messy. Once, when I coughed at night, she shouted from her bedroom, "Old people should be in nursing homes, not disturbing others at night." Daniel heard it. He didn't defend me. He laughed. That was the moment I knew. Respect had died completely. He began turning my small habits into jokes. My legs were weak. Sometimes when I sat down, the chair creaked beneath me. He'd mimic me in front of his friends, groaning, clutching his back, making everyone laugh. Everyone except me. I sat there quietly, shrinking a little more each day. I asked myself, is this really the child I once held? The boy I carried on my shoulders? But no answer could explain such cruelty. His arrogance worsened. When I reminded him of the sacrifices I'd made, he waved me off. "Mom, stop living in the past. You just did what any parent should. This is my life now." My existence became nothing more than an obligation he despised. I was no longer the woman who built the ground he stood on, just an old figure taking up space. He complained about groceries, electricity, and medicine, even though I still contributed part of my pension every month. He spoke as if every dollar I spent was stolen from him, forgetting the millions I had poured into his hands over the years. Sometimes he'd sneer, "You should be thankful I don't charge you rent." I wanted to scream, "You're living rent-free in the house I built." But I swallowed those words. Silence became my armor. I thought silence meant strength. I thought patience would soften disrespect, but patience only fed his greed. Daniel started acting like the master of the house, while I became the servant. Close the door. Turn off the light. Don't sit there. Each command was a reminder that I no longer had dignity in the home that was rightfully mine. Even my grandchildren began to mirror their father's tone. They saw how Daniel spoke to me and copied him. They giggled when I moved slowly. They ignored me when I spoke. It wasn't their fault. Children only learn what they see. But watching that same disregard flicker in their eyes cut deeper than words ever could. I endured the humiliation in silence, but inside it burned like fire. I remembered those nights when I worked double shifts so he could have Christmas presents, the time I pawned my only gold ring so he could go on a school trip, the countless sacrifices no one ever saw, the battles I fought alone to give him a life better than mine. And now that same child treated me as if I were indebted to him. Respect was gone. The dignity I'd hoped for in my old age never arrived. In its place came demands, arrogance, and ridicule. I blamed myself. Maybe I had spoiled him. Maybe I had given too much. I never made him struggle. I thought love would teach him gratitude, but no, it only taught him greed. Each time I tried to talk about right and wrong, he dismissed me. Each time I reminded him of the truth, he silenced me. To him, I was no longer a mother. I was a burden, an inconvenience, an outdated piece of furniture taking up space. Those first signs of disrespect were not random. They were warnings, and I ignored them. Until that night, the night disrespect turned into public humiliation, the night that changed everything. It was an ordinary evening, the kind you never expect to remember. But the moments that change a life often hide inside the quietest nights. The family sat at the dinner table. Marissa had cooked, and the children were tapping their spoons, making noise instead of eating. I sat at my usual place, waiting for everyone to serve themselves before I took my share. I had learned not to reach first. Every time I did, I felt their silent scorn. So I waited. When the dishes came around, I took a small portion, just enough to eat. My appetite wasn't what it used to be. But that night, after finishing my plate, I still felt a hollow ache in my stomach. I looked around the table, saw there was food left, and said politely, "Could I have another serving of rice, please?" It was a simple request, something any mother should be able to say in her own home without fear. But the room fell silent. Then Daniel's face tightened with irritation. He looked at me as if I had just insulted him. At first he said nothing. He simply grabbed the glass of red wine beside his plate. Before I could even understand what was happening, he leaned across the table and flung the wine straight into my face. The cold liquid hit me like a slap. My blouse soaked instantly, red spilling down like blood. The plate before me was ruined, rice floating in a pool of wine. I froze, stunned, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was a joke. But he didn't. His eyes were ice, his lips pressed tight, and he hissed, "That's enough. Stop acting like a queen in my house." My hands trembled as I reached for a napkin. The children stared, wide-eyed, unsure whether to laugh or be afraid. Marissa gave a faint, awkward smile, trying to make it seem like nothing had happened. But there was no trace of compassion in her eyes. It felt as though the entire table had turned its back on me. My heart didn't break because of the wine. Wine dries, clothes dry. But dignity, once trampled by those you love, never heals. I sat there, frozen, humiliated, unable to move, unable to defend myself. I thought of all the nights I'd gone hungry so he could eat, of the calluses on my hands, the small bones I'd broken, the years of labor that built the roof above his head. And now I was treated like a beggar in the house I had made. I didn't shout. I didn't throw the glass back. I didn't curse or storm away. I just sat still, letting the wine drip from my face, soak through my blouse, and slide onto the floor, while my son continued his meal as if nothing had happened. That silence was heavier than any scream. It was the silence of a mother realizing her son no longer saw her as his mother. The dinner table had become a courtroom, and I had been sentenced without the chance to speak. Every bite he took after flinging that wine was a declaration that I was beneath him, beneath even the strangers in his life. I glanced at the children. They were whispering, giggling softly, as if they had just watched a comedy show. That hurt more than the wine itself. They were learning that mocking their grandmother was acceptable. They were learning that her dignity was worth nothing. I wanted to stand up and leave, but my legs felt made of lead, so I stayed seated until they were done eating. No one offered me another serving. No one said sorry. When the plates were cleared, I slowly rose from my chair, my cold blouse clinging to my skin, and walked back to my room. Behind me, the sound of laughter and clinking dishes carried on, life moving forward as if my humiliation were just another forgettable moment. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, my hair still damp, and looked down at my hands. They were shaking, not from age, but from fury. I thought of the first time I held him, so small, so fragile, and how I'd promised to protect him forever. And now, that same child had thrown wine in my face because I'd asked for food. My chest tightened, not from cold, but from the realization that something inside me had shattered. The pride of a mother, once cracked, can never be mended. I wiped my face again, but no towel could erase that memory. It had carved itself deep into my mind. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every second. Each time I saw the image of that glass flying across the table, my jaw clenched. Each time I pictured his cold, superior eyes, my heart turned to ice. I knew then. The years of silent endurance were over. I had tolerated the insults, believing they would fade. I had swallowed the mockery, the complaints, the lies that I was a burden. But this was different. This wasn't mere disrespect. This was public humiliation. This was a message. You are nothing. And that was the moment I decided to show him who truly was nothing. My hands shook as I closed the door behind me. The hush inside those four walls felt heavier than anything I had carried in my life. I sat on the edge of the bed, my blouse still damp, my skin sticky from the wine, and slowly wiped my face with trembling hands. The humiliation did not fade when the fabric dried. A towel can blot away liquid, but it cannot erase the feeling of being reduced in front of your own family. I looked into the mirror, and for the first time I didn't recognize the woman staring back. A face carved by years of work, fine lines etched deep, eyes rimmed red not only with age, but with held-back tears, lips pressed so tight no sound could escape. I thought of every sacrifice that face had witnessed, every scar and ache earned by always putting others first. I remembered going hungry so he could eat, the winters I walked home with worn shoes so he could have a warm coat. All those images raced through my mind as I sat there, humiliated because he had flung wine in my face over a request for food. My chest chilled. My body trembled, not from the wine, but from the realization that I had been blind for too long. That night, laughter drifted from the next room. Marissa chatting, Daniel chuckling as if nothing had happened. My shame meant nothing to them. To them, it was an ordinary evening. To me, it was the night I buried the last piece of my patience. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling for hours. Sleep would not come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his arm swing, the glass tip, the wine arcing toward my face. I felt the sting again and again. I thought of shouting, of confronting him in front of everyone, but I knew yelling would satisfy him. He wanted me to break, to show weakness, so I stayed silent. That silence became my weapon that night, not because I accepted the humiliation, but because I began to plan my reply. I told myself, this silence will not end in defeat. It will end in his downfall. I remembered how I had built his life, the years of stitches, the savings, the investments under his name but still in my control. He mocked me like I was nothing, but in truth, everything he believed he owned was mine. I realized then that my silence would be the last silence of shame. From that moment on, it would be the silence of calculation. I wiped my face again, but this time the motion was not shameful. It was deliberate. He thought the wine had washed away my dignity. He did not know he had awakened something in me that had slept for too long. My patience, which he mistook for weakness, had become my strength. I pictured the morning he would wake and find the life he flaunted, the money he squandered, the power he thought he held, gone. I pictured his arrogance collapsing into panic, his confidence curdling into fear. The thought steadied me. For years I had not wanted revenge. I wanted peace. But that night I understood peace would come only through justice, and the quiet shame I had carried turned into a quiet resolve. I lay in bed and made myself a promise. This moment, this glass of wine across my face, would not be the end of my story. It would be the turning point. I leaned back, slowing my breath. Outside, the sound of laughter carried through the walls, clinking dishes, easy voices. The night moved on as if nothing had happened, but inside my room, something was taking shape in silence. A plan, a decision, a steadiness no one could see. My son thought he had broken me. He thought the wine had made me powerless. But in truth, it was the last mistake he would ever make. From that night forward, my silence was no longer the silence of weakness. It became the calm before a storm. I stayed awake, thinking of all the things Daniel believed were his. He moved around the villa as if he were the owner. He bragged to neighbors that he was supporting me. He spent money from accounts he thought belonged to him. What he had forgotten, or perhaps never bothered to learn, was that I had never surrendered control. I had opened those accounts with him so he could learn responsibility. But I had never removed my name, never signed away my rights, never given him ownership. The truth was simple. The villa, the savings, the investments, every major asset still legally belonged to me. He believed he held power because he had a card with his name on it. He mistook access for ownership. But all those accounts were built by me, through years of labor, not his effort. I had merely allowed his name to stand beside mine out of generosity. If I wished, I could close every account in a day. If I wished, I could withdraw every cent without asking him. He never realized that true control had never left my hands. I had simply trusted too much, believed too deeply that he would show gratitude, respect, and grace when I grew old. I still remember the day we created those accounts. The bank manager looked at me and asked, "Are you sure you want to include his name, ma'am?" And I smiled and said, "Of course. He's my son. I trust him." Now those words sat in my chest like a stone. That trust had been repaid with a glass of wine to my face. That trust had turned into humiliation. But that night, I realized it was also my shield. My silence was not submission. It was a cover. Because while he believed he had shamed a powerless old woman, the truth was that I still held every string that governed his life. His future wasn't self-made. It was mine to give, or to take away. He had mocked me. He had called me lucky to live in his house. But the deed still carried my name. He said I was costing him money. But every account he flaunted was funded by me. He said I was nothing. But the truth was, without me, he had nothing. That was the truth he had forgotten. I sat up in bed, picturing his proud walk, his voice bragging to guests, his careless swipes of the card that linked him to wealth he hadn't earned. Every brick, every dollar, every illusion of security came from me. He had built his arrogance on a foundation that was never his to begin with. That night, humiliation sharpened into something colder, clearer. I no longer felt like a victim. I felt like someone holding a loaded weapon no one could see. My son's entitlement existed only as long as the provider stayed silent, and I had been silent long enough. I kept telling myself over and over that I still had authority. I still had rights. I was still the owner. They thought I was just an old woman who sat in a corner. But legally and financially, I held every card, and if I chose to pull them, their life would collapse overnight. That forgotten truth steadied me. It eased the tremor in my hands. It turned my humiliation into fuel. He believed a single splash of wine had erased my dignity. But in reality, he had handed me the reason to act. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to the house sleep, hearing them breathe as if their world were unbroken. But I knew something they did not. The world they walked through belonged to me, and I could take it away whenever I wished. That knowledge made the air lighter in my lungs. For the first time in years, I did not feel cornered. I was not weak. I did not need their pity. It was the opposite. They were the ones who would be trapped in my hands. That forgotten truth was power, and soon they would learn it painfully. The next morning, I woke with a clear head and a burning resolve. I no longer felt like the woman humiliated by wine. I felt like someone holding the last card in a game my son didn't even know he was losing. I dressed slowly, put on a clean blouse, and ate breakfast alone in a quiet corner. That morning, he didn't look at me once. Not a greeting, not a nod. That only made my decision firmer. I went back to my room and took down the folder where I had kept the bank papers, the deed, the account details. I had gathered them over the years, kept them safe, because a small part of me always knew trust could turn to betrayal. I read the names, traced the signatures, and saw clearly what my next steps would be. The accounts were joint in access, but I was the primary name. The villa was in my name alone. The investments were registered under me. He thought everything was his, but on paper, it belonged to me. That was the weapon. That was the plan. I picked up the phone and called the bank manager. He had known me for years, had seen my monthly deposits, my steady withdrawals. I spoke calmly, asked him to review the accounts and confirm who held transfer authority. He verified what I already knew. Only I did. My son had access, not ownership. His name was there for convenience, not control. The power was in my hands. I told the manager I wanted an appointment. He reserved me a slot that afternoon. I packed the papers into a small bag and prepared. At lunch, I sat quietly, saying nothing, watching my son joke with his wife as if everything were perfect. He didn't know that by evening his life would begin to unravel. I did not confront him. I did not argue. I kept my silence because this battle would not be won with words. It would be won with signatures and directives. I went to the bank that afternoon. The manager greeted me with a respectful nod, and I told him what I wanted. I wanted every dollar in those accounts moved into a new personal account. My name alone, no shared access, no joint signatures, nothing. Completely mine. He looked surprised for a moment, then nodded. "That is your right, ma'am," he said. I signed the forms. Page after page, stroke after stroke, I erased my son from the financial kingdom he thought was his. By the time I left the office, $5,000 had been transferred into an account he would never touch again. His name was removed from the records. His cards were canceled. The money he bragged about, the savings he flaunted, the future he thought was secure, vanished in a single afternoon. I walked out of that bank feeling lighter than I had in years. My humiliation was no longer an open wound. It was a closed file. I had turned shame into action. The plan was working, but I was not finished. That evening when I returned home, he was on the couch watching TV, joking with his wife. He didn't notice the change in my face. He didn't know I had taken everything. I sat quietly, drank a glass of water, and kept my silence. This was not about confrontation. It was about watching his pride crumble on its own. I went to my room, packed a few clothes into a bag, took my passport, my medicine, the papers I needed. I booked a one-way ticket out of the country. A new beginning, far from his arrogance. He would not expect it. One morning he would wake to declined cards, empty accounts, a world collapsed, and I would be gone. I looked around the bedroom one last time and felt no sorrow. This was no longer my home. It had become my prison, and I was about to set myself free. Simple, decisive. Take back what was mine, leave without a word, and let him drown in the silence he helped create. That night, for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. The wine had dried on my blouse, but the stain on his conscience would never wash out. He had mocked me for asking for another serving. Soon he would be begging for every cent, and I would not be there to hear it. The plan was in motion. Once the transfers were complete and the money secured, I knew the next steps had to be swift and quiet. I could not give him even the smallest hint, or he might resist, argue, even lash out. I would not allow that. So I moved like a person preparing for a journey no one else should know about. I pulled out my old travel bag, the one I'd taken on business trips years ago, and began to pack. I packed only what I needed: a few sets of clothes, my passport, medicine, personal papers, and a handful of photographs I couldn't leave behind. Everything else stayed. I didn't want weight. I wanted freedom. I folded each piece neatly, tucked the documents into a hidden pocket, zipped the bag, then sat for a moment on the edge of the bed, staring at a room that had once been mine, yet never felt like home. It was meant to be my refuge in old age. It had become a cage. I didn't feel sadness leaving it, only release. I checked my phone and confirmed the flight I'd booked the night before, a one-way ticket out of the country. I'd chosen a quiet coastal town abroad, somewhere no one would look for me, where no one knew my son's name or my humiliation. The flight was in 2 days, enough to prepare, not enough to be noticed. For those 2 days, I behaved as always. I ate my meals in silence. I sat in my corner of the living room when I had to, keeping out of their way. Daniel mocked me again for my quietness, saying, "Old people just run out of things to say." I smiled inside, knowing that soon he would have everything to say, and nothing left to hold. I withdrew small amounts of cash from different branches, careful not to draw attention, until I had what I needed in hand. Then I emailed my attorney, asking him to prepare a sealed letter to deliver to Daniel after I'd gone. He was to say nothing of my destination, only confirm that my decision was final. He agreed. I trusted he would do it. That last night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, the flicker of the television from the next room, the soft laughter through the walls. And I felt a strange calm. I knew it was the last time I'd ever hear those sounds. At dawn, I dressed, lifted my bag, and left without a word. No one noticed me go. Daniel was still asleep. His wife snored beside him. The children dreamed. I stepped into the morning air, the weight in my chest finally lifting. The street was quiet. The sky was pale, opening to light. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was walking as a free person. I called a cab and went straight to the airport. The ride was long, but I didn't look back. My eyes stayed on the road ahead, on the city fading behind me. I was erasing myself from their lives. At the terminal, I moved through the motions calmly, checked my bag, showed my passport, waited at the gate. Around me were families, couples, travelers chasing holidays. I sat quietly, an old woman leaving not for joy, but for justice. When boarding began, I walked down the jet bridge with steady steps, took my seat, fastened my belt, and watched through the window as the plane began to move. When the plane lifted off the ground, I felt the last chain break. I was gone. By the time Daniel woke, there would be nothing left. No mother, no money, no foundation. The kingdom he had built on arrogance had collapsed overnight. I imagined his face when he tried his card and saw it declined. I imagined the panic in his voice when he called the bank, only to hear that he no longer had any rights. I imagined him running through the house, finding my room empty, my things gone, and silence filling every corner. That was my disappearance. Not loud, not violent, but absolute. I left no trace, no forwarding address, no clue. I erased myself from the world he lived in, just as he had tried to erase my dignity. As the plane cut through the clouds, I leaned back and closed my eyes. I was no longer humiliated. I was no longer the old woman mocked at the dinner table. I was a woman who had taken back what was hers and vanished before anyone could stop her. It was the beginning of my life and the end of his. That morning, Daniel woke as if it were just another day. He walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, chatting loudly with Marissa about bills and weekend plans. He reached for his wallet, pulled out a bank card, and told her he'd handle the payments after breakfast. He unlocked his phone, ready to log into the account. That was the first moment his smile began to fade. The screen flashed an error. He frowned, tried again, harder this time. Same message. He muttered under his breath, annoyed, and reached for another card. He tried to make a quick payment, but the system declined it. He chuckled nervously, assuming it was a glitch. Then he tried again, and again, and again. By the fourth attempt, the truth began to sink in. Marissa looked at him, confused. "What's going on?" she asked. He brushed her off. "Bank's having issues," he said. But inside, panic was rising. He called the bank. After the usual security questions, the voice on the other end spoke calmly. "Sir, your name is no longer associated with that account. Access has been revoked. The cards have been canceled. The account now belongs solely to Mrs. Eleanor Whitman." His voice cracked. "There must be a mistake," he shouted. But the representative repeated the same words. He had no access, no authority, no control. The transfers had been completed. The money was gone. He slammed the phone down, then called back, demanding another agent, another explanation. But every reply was the same. His arrogance began to unravel into desperation. Marissa pressed him, asking what revoked meant, and he lied, saying it was a temporary hold. But his silence gave him away. The color drained from his face. His hands shook. For the first time, he realized everything he thought was his, the savings, the security, the future, had vanished overnight. He ran through the house, shouting my name. When he opened my door, he found only the bare bed, the empty shelves, and the quiet echo of absence. My suitcase? Gone. My papers? Gone. My presents? Gone. That silence was the punishment. He called me again and again, but my phone was off, the SIM card destroyed. He sent message after message, his words shifting from anger to panic, then to pleading. First, "Mom, what did you do?" Then, "You can't do this to me." Finally, "Please, Mom, let's talk." But none of those words reached me. I had severed that line forever. Marissa stood in the kitchen, stunned, watching the man who once bragged about being in control reduced to nothing. The children stared, silent, as their father paced and shouted, then collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. For the first time, they saw fear in his eyes. He drove to the bank, demanded to see the manager, but the answer was the same. They showed him the documents, my signatures, the transfers, the sealed confirmations. Legally, he was nothing. He left the bank a shadow of the man who had once strutted through its doors. The arrogance was gone. The calls to friends went unanswered the moment they realized he could no longer pay his debts. Bills piled up with no money to meet them. The life he flaunted began to crumble, piece by piece. Marissa turned cold. She asked him why he lied, why he made her believe they were secure when everything had been built on what I gave. Their arguments grew louder each night, echoing through the thin walls of Palm Vista Villa. Neighbors began to whisper. The man who once mocked his own mother for asking for food was now struggling to feed his own family. Panic turned into shame, and shame into silence. The humiliation he had poured onto me that night at the dinner table had come back to him, tenfold. My disappearance had taken more than money. It had stripped away his image, his pride, his power, and his control. He learned that a man who throws wine in his mother's face should be prepared for his own future to be drained dry. He had thought I was weak. He had thought I was old and powerless. But when the truth hit, he was the one left with nothing. That was justice. His arrogance had burned to ash, his family was unraveling, his future erased. And my silence was louder than any speech of revenge I could have given. Weeks passed after I vanished, and my son's life was falling apart piece by piece. Arrogance had given way to desperation. His calls went unanswered, his messages unread, his attempts to find me futile. He went to relatives asking if anyone had seen me. No one had, because I had told no one. Marissa grew colder still, blaming him for the disaster. Even the children began to sense that the safety they once took for granted was gone. The man who used to walk tall now moved with slumped shoulders, eyes cast down, weighed by worry. But I wasn't finished. I wanted one final strike, not with money or property, but with words that would cut deeper than anything else. That's why I had arranged it before leaving. I'd given my lawyer, Mr. Harold Pierce, a sealed envelope to deliver weeks after my disappearance. Inside was a single piece of paper. He waited, watching the chaos unfold, until the right moment came. One afternoon, as Daniel sat in the living room surrounded by unpaid bills, an angry wife, and silent children, there came a knock at the door. He opened it to find Harold standing there holding the envelope. Daniel frowned. "What's this?" Harold simply said, "From your mother." Daniel's hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside was one short note, written in my own hand. It read, "You threw wine in my face. I drained the life you thought was yours." That was all. No signature, no return address, just finality. He stared at the paper, reading the lines again and again, his expression shifting, from anger to disbelief to despair. Marissa leaned over, read it once, and walked away without a word. The silence that filled that room was heavier than any sound he had ever known. He understood, in that instant, that this was no mistake, not a temporary punishment, but a permanent consequence. He tried calling Harold, demanding to know where I was. Harold repeated exactly what I had instructed him to say. "Your mother has made her decision. That's all you need to know." Daniel screamed, pleaded, threatened, but nothing worked. The line went dead, and so did the last illusion he'd ever controlled anything. When the lawyer left, my son stood alone at the doorway, clutching the piece of paper that had ended his world. That tiny note was stronger than any confrontation could have been. It reminded him of the night he humiliated me, the moment he believed I was powerless, and showed him how deeply mistaken he had been. He understood then that respect cannot be bought, and once lost, it can never be regained. He understood that his mother was not weak, not helpless. She had been the foundation beneath his life, and when that foundation was removed, there was nothing left. He kept that note, perhaps hoping that one day I would return, but I never will. That message was the last thread between us, a reminder, a punishment, and a truth carved into his mind forever. After sending that final message through my lawyer, I closed the last chapter of my life with my son. I didn't check for replies. I didn't ask how he was doing. I didn't want to hear about his downfall. My revenge was not about seeing him cry or beg. My revenge was ensuring he understood that he had destroyed the very bridge that carried him through life. And now he would have to face the emptiness, alone. I began my new life in a quiet coastal town, far from the place where I had been humiliated. Here, no one knew my name. No one knew my past. No one saw me as a burden. I rented a small apartment near the sea, modest but peaceful. In the mornings I walked along the shore, breathing in the salt air, feeling the sand under my feet, listening to the waves against the rocks. Each step reminded me that I was free, that I had reclaimed my dignity. In the afternoons, I sat at a cafe with a newspaper, sipping coffee slowly, with no one to mock me, no one to rush me. At night, I cooked simple meals, small portions I could savor without a single disapproving glance. Life became quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that heals, not the kind that breaks. Sometimes I think about Daniel. I wonder if he still tries to explain to Marissa that everything is gone, or if he still looks at that note, angry or regretful. But those thoughts no longer hurt me. They remind me of justice. He had thrown wine at me, trying to wash away my dignity in front of his family. In return, I washed away his future with a single signature. He had forgotten that everything he had came from me, and I made sure he remembered in the harshest way possible. Later, my lawyer wrote to me once more, not with details, but with confirmation. Every instruction had been followed. The accounts were mine. The house was transferred. The investments secured. My son was left with only his pride. And pride cannot feed a family. That was his sentence. My justice was never about shouting. It was never about fists or fights. It was about silence, paperwork, and finality. Justice to me was not watching him suffer. It was knowing he could no longer control me, could no longer humiliate me, could no longer pretend to own what I built. Justice was walking by the ocean with no weight on my shoulders. Justice was knowing that every time he stared at his empty accounts, he would remember that night at the dinner table. The glass of wine, my silence, and the truth that came too late. His mother was never powerless. In the end, he lost everything. Not because of greed, not because of fate, but because he could not give the smallest thing of all, a little respect. That was the price, that was the lesson, and that was my justice.